All right, so in Module 6, we're going to spend a good amount of time discussing logs. And I'm going to try to differentiate what a log is versus a behavioral observation measure, which is something that a lot of people kind of get confused on. I'm also going to be talking about measurement and reactivity, different types of single system designs, and baselining. A client log is an organized journal of events related to a client's problem or goal, including antecedents and consequences. So typically when people think about logs, they think about documenting caloric intake or documenting exercise. Within single system design, we also create logs in order to get qualitative information, such as what was the cause of somebody to not exercise or what led them to exercise more. Other examples might be if somebody were struggling with anxiety and they were rating their anxiety intensity. What were certain things that caused them to feel more anxious during the day? Was it a test that was coming up, or was it driving somewhere? And because of the anxiety, what was the consequence? Did they avoid certain kind of tasks or avoid people? So that's more of what's meant about logs within the term of single system design. So structured logs can include a structured journal, which is a little bit different to like a free-flowing diary. A structured log would include kind of like comments related to the behavioral observation measure. So if you're to be documenting minutes of sleep per night, a log would include maybe different comments about what led to improved sleep or maybe sleep disturbances. This should be kept by the client. Sometimes by others can help make documents in the log as well, but it follows a particular structure. So it's more structured than just a journal or like a free-flowing diary, and it helps you to keep comments about why there might be fluctuations in the behavioral observation measure, or why things might be changing in the way that they are. So a client log is also a form of self-monitoring, and it gives a little bit more context into the reason why a behavioral observation measure might be changing in the way that it is. And again, the key difference here is that it's qualitative rather than quantitative. And so the big difference between quantitative is that we're looking at a specific number or frequency, intensity, duration with a quantitative measure, versus a qualitative measure is more of like the why. Why did somebody increase the amount of time they spend thinking about gambling, or why did they increase their alcohol content or consumption? So that's where logs can be helpful in giving like a voice to the numbers. And you can include these in your graphs as well, and it helps with interpretation of the effectiveness of the single system design. So this is an example of a critical incident log. So you can see that these logs are a little bit more structured here. It's got a breakdown of time, incidents, and comments. So kind of sticking with the alcohol consumption example, you could imagine maybe somebody had gone to a work event and there was an incident where they had a strong urge to consume alcohol. And the comment could be that they used some of their coping skills to say no, or they contacted their AA sponsor in order to help fight or combat some of those urges. You could also have like a time where they watched a commercial for beer and had a solid urge to go to the store and buy alcohol. But the comment might be that they pictured the results of what might happen if they were to relapse again and were able to avert consuming alcohol. So this is a little bit more of a qualitative approach. And you can use this to kind of give rich meaning to the behavioral observation measures and the quantitative data. And you can incorporate it into your graphs as well. So if this were an example of a single system design, you can see the different comments here that were utilized from a log and then incorporated into a graph. So if they were doing a daily rating of self-esteem, you could see on days where they had low self-esteem, there was a report due at work this week, versus like on a Saturday, somebody had a social event that increased their self-esteem rating. So as opposed to just seeing the ups and downs within a behavioral observation measure, this helps you put some context into why the numbers are either raising or falling. How can you maximize the reliability and validity of a client log? I would say one of the big things to keep in mind is measurement reactivity, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute, but just kind of reassuring people that these logs are for their benefit and you're not here to judge them or not here to make them feel bad about themselves, but really trying to get to the root of the problem and seeing what can be changed and maybe patterns in people's behaviors. So if we notice that somebody routinely has something that pops up they may be unaware of, maybe they're binge eating because of a certain circumstance that they find themselves in, or maybe they're smoking because they're around a certain person. The logs can help them to figure that out about themselves, and by reassuring the client that this is meant to help them, it can reduce some of the measurement reactivity and improve the validity of those logs. And to verify the validity of the client log, you can just essentially review it with the client and see if this is really accurate and really if it's true or not. So as I mentioned, measurement reactivity, you could think of this as the Hawthorne effect, or maybe demand characteristics of somebody. If they know that they're being measured, they may want to be perceived in a certain way, more of a positive light, and may be uncomfortable sharing some of their challenging behaviors or thoughts or actions with the clinician. So measurement reactivity is basically when a client's problem or goal changes as a result of being measured or monitored. So a reason that happens is because a client adapts to a role. So you can imagine that somebody might be mandated to treatment and really wants you to perceive them as making progress, or maybe they don't want to be on probation anymore. They might want to be perceived in a certain way, so they might be less likely to be honest and forthright with you. Another issue might just be evaluation apprehension. Some of you have probably thought about with the single system design, just the very idea of somebody monitoring their every behavior can cause people to be apprehensive. So it's important to kind of comfort the client and help them to normalize this experience and make them feel as comfortable as possible so that they're giving you as accurate of information as possible. And again, to reassure them that the purpose of this is not to judge them, but rather to help them achieve their goals and improve their quality of life. Another form of measurement reactivity is the testing effect. So if somebody's completing the same measure repeatedly, which is kind of the basis of single system design, people tend to be a little bit less thoughtful, insightful, or honest with their measures and kind of skim through it as fast as they can often. So it's important to kind of check in with people and see if they're really taking their time and being forthright, or if they're kind of rushing their way through it. There can also be characteristics of the observer or client, or the overseer of data collection that causes people to react a certain way. So you can imagine if you were to share information with a male therapist versus a female therapist versus an older therapist versus a younger therapist. Sometimes there's those demand characteristics that might change somebody's responses. So there's some factors like that might come up, and I think it's important to address them as best as you can, to try to make yourself be more supportive in this role. And just to kind of like give a little anecdote here, measurement reactivity and Hawthorne effect are generally used interchangeably. So you may have heard about the Hawthorne effect, which is essentially the fact that people change their behaviors based on the fact that they're being monitored. So the example of the Hawthorne factory was that a researcher came in and said that if we increase light in a factory, that people are going to be working harder. So as the researcher came into this factory and increased the lights, productivity went up. But the problem there is that there was no real control for this. So there were a different researcher that came in and put in 3 different conditions. One which had increased light, one which had light be the same, and one which had decreased lighting in the factory. And the result was that all 3 conditions improved productivity. So the finding was that it had nothing really to do with the light, and rather the fact that there were researchers observing people's behaviors. So that's why it's important to realize that just by the very fact of monitoring somebody's behavior, they're likely to change, or likely to change their response. So that can be used in a positive way, to encourage or promote change, but also can be used, sometimes there can be some cautions in that somebody might be less likely to share their true experience or accurate behaviors with you. So in order to overcome measurement reactivity, it's important to use valid and reliable measures, making sure that the measures that you're using are standardized for the population that you're working with. Also using multiple measures. If you're relying on just one measure, it's going to be a lot more susceptible to measurement reactivity. So it's better to use multiple measures, verifying sources, and that's going to give you more accurate, valid results. And also just encouraging the client to be as honest as possible. I mean, it's always difficult and uncomfortable for some people to be under the microscope like this. So I'd say it's a good idea to kind of check in and remind your client that this is for their benefit, for the purposes of improving their quality of life, for their life experience, and not for the purposes of judgment. and obviously kind of building that trust and rapport with them. So just as we wrap up our measurement section here, just try to keep in mind to minimize measurement burden as much as possible. So for this single system design that you're doing for the course, I'm hoping that you get an experience of what it's like to go through a single system design and practice evaluation. And there is more work and effort that goes into it, but I think that also increases insight. And hopefully you find that it's worth it for your practice. And through doing this, you'll kind of work through some of the kinks in order to minimize that measurement burden. And your first SSD is probably going to be the hardest, but afterwards you'll figure out ways to kind of streamline that data collection. And as we discussed in the prologue, some of that data might already be out there, so there isn't too much additional measurement burden to be added. Also keep in mind that the more objective measures are behavioral observation and standardized measures. So again, standardized measures are already validated, normed, there's reliability and validity measures out there. And behavioral observations are a little bit harder to fabricate because there is real quantifiable behaviors out there that are easily observable. Versus an individualized rating scale or a log measures kind of like a feeling or a perception. So it's a good idea to get a mixture of multiple different types of measurement that are going to help you get a fuller, more accurate picture of the client problem. So back to the big picture for the course here, looking at evaluation designs. There's a few different types of single system designs out there. Most commonly, people use just like an A/B baseline intervention, and that's all that's required for this course. But as you move into practice, I'd like for you to at least have some familiarity with the different types of single system designs that are out there. So as we're looking at these graphs, the letter A typically indicates a baseline phase where there's no intervention yet in place. The letters following A designate an intervention or a baseline phase. So it's usually like a B for intervention or M for maintenance. All right, so baselining, you've probably heard me use this already, but it's essentially just a systematic collection of information on a client's problem during any non-intervention phase. So the reason we want a baseline is so that we can have something to compare our intervention data to. So without really knowing what the problem was like before we stepped in, we can't really accurately assess whether or not we've really made the changes that we're hoping to. So a baseline phase helps us to determine what the problem would have been like if we had never gotten involved in the first place. And ultimately represents what would reasonably be expected to continue without any form of intervention. With single system design, B typically indicates an intervention, a package, a program, something that's been put in place to address the client's conceptually or operationally defined problem. And hopefully it results in a quantifiable change in either their objective or subjective complaint. Okay, so within single system design here, you can see a baseline and an intervention phase. So the baseline phase is before any kind of intervention is put in place, and it's usually signified by the letter A, versus the intervention phase is indicated by the letter B. So here we can see a geriatric depression score by day. In the baseline phase, indicated by letter A, you can see that depression scales were kind of going up around day 4 or 5. But after an intervention is put in place, you can see a clear downward trend here. So this is a positive decreasing trend in depression score. So positive because we're trying to decrease depression, and decreasing because geriatric depression score is going down. So another important key here is what is a maintenance phase. So a maintenance phase can be less frequent intervention. Instead of meeting with somebody weekly, maybe you're meeting bi-weekly or monthly. Or maybe they're kind of just becoming their own clinician in a way, and that they're able to check in with you less frequently. So there's not the formal intervention anymore, but you would encourage the client to continue monitoring their problem to see if it's getting worse. And if it is getting worse, maybe they need to increase their intervention, or maybe if it's getting better on its own, then they maybe don't need to see you anymore and they can just discontinue treatment. Another thing to point out is sometimes that there can be 2 interventions at the same time. So intervention B and intervention C. Sometimes that would be like, so if you see an A for a baseline and then BC, maybe that can mean that there's 2 interventions simultaneously. Or sometimes they're sequentially. So you might see a first baseline followed by an inpatient more intense intervention followed by a step-down intervention, which might be marked by C. So it's not really a maintenance, but it's a different intervention altogether. So here are some examples here. And this might seem basic, but it's still good for you to know what people are writing up within their single system designs here. So AB represents baseline intervention versus ABC would be a baseline, a second intervention followed by a third intervention. A-BC would mean that there was multiple interventions simultaneously, which kind of raises the question of, could you write A-BC for the two simultaneous interventions, or could you just write AB? The reason I would prefer A-BC is because, let's say if the B intervention was, I don't know, maybe we'll come up with an example of smoking cessation. So maybe the letter B indicates nicotine gum, and C intervention is a hypnosis-based intervention for smoking cessation. So what happens if our intervention is the gum and the hypnosis, and then we eventually get rid of the hypnosis and there's just gum? And then we could indicate within our graph which of those interventions was discontinued, so we can clearly monitor the different phases of the intervention when we're trying to graphically report on what we have done or what the clinical outcomes are. Another thing you might see is AB maintenance. So again, maintenance phase is a less frequent or a less intense form of the intervention.